Hi there, and welcome to the Explaining History podcast. And today I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between Mao and Khrushchev following the death of Stalin. And to do this, I'm going to be reading from Mao's Great Famine by Frank Dakota today. And he starts the book by exploring the rather contrasting, conflicting, and sometimes complex relationship between Stalin and Mao. Mao had started his political career idolising Stalin and grew to bitterly resent him towards the Soviet dictator's death. Frank Dakota writes, Stalin's death in 1953 was Mao's liberation. For more than 30 years, Mao had had to play supplicant to the leader of the communist world. From the age of 27, when he was first handed his first cash payment of 200 yuan by a Soviet agent, to cover the cost of travelling to the founding meeting of the Chinese Communist Party in Shanghai, Mao's life was transformed by Russian funds. He had no qualms about taking the money and used the Moscow link to lead a ragged band of guerrilla fighters to ultimate power, but not without endless reprimands from Moscow, expulsions from office, and battles over party policy with Soviet advisors. Stalin constantly forced Mao back into the arms of his sworn enemy, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the nationalist Kuomintang that ruled much of China. Stalin placed little faith in Mao and his peasant soldiers, and openly favoured Chiang, even after the Kuomintang had presided over a bloody massacre of communists in Shanghai in 1927. For the best part of a decade, Chiang's troops relentlessly hounded and embattled Mao, forcing the communists to find refuge on a mountain base, then to traverse some 12,500 kilometres north in a retreat later known as the Long March. When Chiang was kidnapped in Xi'an in 1936, Stalin promptly sent a telegraph ordering Mao to release his hostage unharmed. After Japan had invaded China a year later, Stalin demanded that Mao again form a united front with his arch-enemy Chiang, sending planes, arms and advisors to the Kuomintang regime. All Mao got during the Second World War was a plane load of propaganda leaflets. So there was a deep resentment there. Now, why did Stalin take this approach to Mao, this suspicion? Well, Mao was deviating from Marxist-Leninism and Stalinism. He believed that the peasants would be the revolutionary class that would overthrow capitalism, and he believed that one could even sidestep the processes that Stalin was introducing in China, in the Soviet Union, and fast-track a peasant communist China to modernity, to socialist modernity. And so Stalin, A, didn't like a deviationist, and B, didn't like the possibility of a rival in peasant China who was possibly going to be the leader of world communism at some point. It was far better to have a reliable anti-Japanese power, Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist, whom he could have dealings with, and who would be a solid force to keep the Japanese at bay, than Mao, who was far more untested and who might turn out to be more trouble than he was worth later on. Mao's rebellious streak, his determination to do things his way, was troubling for Stalin. Stalin, who'd had difficulties enough with independent variants of communism in Yugoslavia, certainly didn't want to see a Tito figure in China. Mao was finally invited to Moscow in December 1949, but not really welcomed as the leader of a great revolution. However, he was invited for Stalin's birthday celebrations, but left days on his own before Stalin would see him. And he was only one guest in a host of many other delegates to go to Moscow, and was given basically the impression that he wasn't particularly important. And this was deliberate, and this was precisely what Stalin wanted to communicate to Mao. Mao was taken to a dacha outside Moscow and left to wait until Stalin chose to see him again. And it was a way of not too subtly showing Mao his place. Stalin, when he finally deigned to see Mao, gave Mao $300 million in military aid over 5 years, far less than Mao had hoped for. And Mao, in return, had to throw in territorial concessions, the treaty port of Lushan or Port Arthur, parts of the Eastern Railway in Manchuria that the Russians had built in the late 19th century. And it reminded Mao of the treaties imposed on China by the British in the 19th century. And opposition to imperialism had been one of the key strengths of Mao's movement. And so to have this kind of slap in the face from another imperial power was something that Mao would never forgive. The ability to mine mineral deposits in Xinjiang was also claimed by Stalin. The kinds of things needed to create weapons, to create artillery shells, the kinds of ores needed to create steel. All of these were mined from China's very mineral-rich earth. During the Korean War, the death toll for the Chinese was immense, and Stalin's promised air cover rarely came. Another sign that Stalin was not very interested in whether the Chinese prevailed or not. So all is considered, when Stalin died, it was a relief for Mao that his humiliation at the hands of Stalin was to come to an end, and the Korean War was the kind of the final nail in the coffin of the Mao-Stalin relationship. And there was a belief by Mao and his contemporaries in China that China should be treated as an equal, that China was every bit the communist power that Russia was. And the Russians did not agree with this, that they looked upon China as the disobedient pupil that needed to be educated and was trying to rush into socialist development and didn't really know what it was doing. So when Stalin died, the ability of China to make a break with Russia or to secure some kind of political independence from Russia and to stake out a claim for the leadership of world socialism was abundantly present, or so Mao thought. The way Mao looked upon things is that whoever followed Stalin would be an insignificant figure within the Soviet Union. However, he was a colossus that strode the world stage, and particularly he was the most significant figure in world communism, and so that he should be the person to take Stalin's crown, so to speak, and that he would be the person who would finally defeat capitalism, who would finally end the struggle with capitalism. And it would be Beijing that would be the centre of world communism in the end, not Moscow. And the reason why Mao was so sure about this was that if China was to adopt a peasant route to socialism, then it was fair to say that in 1953 a majority of the world's population still toiled on the land, and still toiled on the land in poverty. So this was going to be the revolutionary constituency, not just in China, but perhaps in Africa, in South America, in India, and maybe even in Russia itself. When Mao looked at Stalin, he thought, well, here is somebody who was secondary to Lenin and Trotsky, when it came about bringing about the October Revolution. So when Mao looked at Nikita Khrushchev, he thought even less. He thought, well, this person is a complete non-entity. It's not like me, who has brought this kind of second October Revolution, if you like, to China. This is an also-ran. So here I read again from Mao's Great Famine on Khrushchev. Coarse, erratic and impulsive, Khrushchev was viewed by many who knew him as an oaf, limited in both ability and ambition. It was precisely this reputation that had allowed him to survive under Stalin, who treated him with an affectionate condescension that saved him from the fate of far more impressive colleagues who blundered in their dealings with the dictator. "My little Marx," Stalin once mockingly called him, gently tapping his pipe against Khrushchev's forehead and joking. "It's hollow." Khrushchev was Stalin's pet, but he was as paranoid as Stalin, and underneath deceptive clumsiness was a cunning and hugely ambitious man. Khrushchev was scathing of Stalin's handling of Mao, and resolved to outdo his former master by putting relations in Beijing on a new footing. He would be Mao's benevolent tutor, steering the peasant rebel towards a more enlightened form of Marxism. Khrushchev also played the role of beneficent patron, presiding over a massive transfer of technology as hundreds of factories and plants were financed with Soviet aid. Advisors in every domain, from atomic energy to mechanical engineering, were sent to China, while some 10,000 Chinese students were trained in the Soviet Union in the first years following Stalin's death. So there you can see already that Khrushchev misunderstood Mao's intentions after 1953. He misunderstood Mao's ambition and thought that Mao could be used and could be steered, could be guided, could be educated to be a pliant Soviet client dictator. However, when this transfer of materials, of expertise and technology from the Soviet Union to China happens, instead of receiving immense gratitude, the Soviets are baffled by the kind of the arrogance and the sense of entitlement that they find in China. Frank Dakota writes, "Instead of showing gratitude, leaders of Beijing saw this largesse as their due, seeking to extract ever greater amounts of economic and military support through a mixture of bargaining, begging and cajoling. Khrushchev gave in. Having overplayed his hand, he had to bully his colleagues in Moscow into accepting an aid package that far outstripped what the Soviet Union could afford." So Khrushchev, at this point, is trying to satisfy China, and he thought that there would be some reciprocity here, some quid pro quo. But Mao treated him with contempt. He looked upon Khrushchev in much the way that Stalin had, as the kind of upstart Jobsworth, uncultured and uneducated. And in 1956, when Khrushchev denounced Stalin in the secret speech, Mao was apoplectic. Firstly, Mao had not been consulted, and Mao considered himself now of such a stature in the communist world that any major announcement or utterance needed to be run by him first, which shows you again Mao's ego and his vanity. Also, Mao in communist China was modelling communist China on high Stalinism, with labour camps, mass killings and famines, and all the processes of collectivization that Stalin had brought about in the Soviet Union. So any criticism of Stalin and any criticism of Stalinism was an implied criticism of Mao as well. De-Stalinization in Mao's eyes was a challenge to Mao's position. De-Maoization, I suppose he saw it as. And Mao believed if anyone was there to criticize Stalin, it was him, not a little upstart like Khrushchev. In 1956 too, at the 8th Party Congress in Beijing in September, the references to Mao Zedong thought started to be removed from the party's constitution. Why? Because the secret speech there had been sort of effective ripples and shockwaves around the world from the secret speech, and particularly around the communist world, where cults of personality and the infallibility of the leader, these all began to be questioned. So the secret speech did have real consequences for Mao. And particularly a vain and egotistical man like Mao, who could not stand to be slighted or made to look foolish in any way. And another problem that Mao encountered was his economic policy, which was referred to as the Socialist high tide, which ended in 1956 at the second plenum of the party conference. A year earlier, Mao, displeased and impatient with the very sort of ponderous and slow pace of economic development, had criticised and sort of character assassinated those who were more cautious. He referred to them as women with bound feet who were going too slow. So Mao thought that there would be a massive increase in agricultural output as a result of collectivisation. And in January 1956, he starts to demand hugely unrealistic increases in the output of industrial and agricultural products, such as coal and steel and cotton and grain. The economic predictions that Mao was coming up with were partly the result of his own imagination, and partly the result that nobody wanted to give Mao bad news, and partly the result that Mao had purged too many experts, or he purged most experts, people that could give him more sober and realistic views about what was economically possible. These predictions obviously failed. Industrial production suffered from problems in the cities. There were shortages of raw materials, or there were bottlenecks, or there was overproduction in certain areas. And there were shortages of funds to buy plant and machinery. There were shortages of fuel. In the countryside, collectivization was an unmitigated disaster, as it had been in the Soviet Union, and farmers slaughtered their cattle, much as the Soviet farmers had done, and famine appeared in provinces during 1956. So these economic shock tactics suddenly came in for criticism. Zhou Enlai referred to these as the rash advance that had to temporarily stop. And so very quickly the size of collective farms declined, and a limited free market emerged in the countryside. And Mao once again saw this as a personal challenge, a personal slight. And so in 1956, in the People's Daily newspaper, in June that month, the paper was bold enough to actually criticise the socialist high tide for attempting to do all things overnight. Mao scrawled on this, "I will not read this." He scrawled on his own copy of this. And he later questioned himself, saying, "Why should I read something that abuses me?" He was further weakened because during the secret speech, Khrushchev had also highlighted the fact that collectivization had failed. So the very same policy that had caused famine in Ukraine and in Kazakhstan and in other parts of the Soviet Union had led to catastrophe in China as well. So the socialist high tide was scrapped at the 8th Party Congress, making Mao again look foolish, and this was a resentment he would store up against Khrushchev for many years. Despite the fact that there were reservations from other party leaders, Mao decided, as a result of this failing, to encourage criticism of the party in April 1957 with the 100 Flowers campaign. Now, about 3 or 4 years ago, I did a podcast on that, so it is in the archive somewhere. Mao basically hoped that by calling on everyday Chinese citizens to voice their opinions, a small number of his enemies and counter-revolutionaries, rightists, would be uncovered, and he assumed that the majority of Chinese people would say what a great job he'd been doing, so he could have both the best of both worlds, a large base of vocal support, and he could expose those people who were his enemies. And he thought that what this would do is it would prevent the kind of process of de-Stalinization that was now causing chaos in countries like Hungary, which was enjoying the very temporary overthrow of the communist regime there. However, the 100 Flowers campaign leads to the most vocal uprising against communism that China had seen since 1949, and it resulted in the brutal suppression of the sources of dissent. Mao simply saw the critics, he referred to them as bad elements who were trying to destroy the party and the revolution, and Deng Xiaoping was put in charge of the counterattack, which was carried out with savage violence, targeting 500,000 people, who were mainly students and intellectuals, who were shipped off to do hard labour in the countryside. The thing that seems to keep recurring throughout the period 1949 to 1975 is that Mao, 1976 I beg your pardon, when he died, that Mao is able to keep pulling these kinds of stunts to get back in control, or to keep using extreme violence or chaos to place himself back in control. The whole issue of the 100 Flowers was a humiliation to Mao, but the strategy was successful in that it helped to create the situation whereby Mao could reassert his power. The 100 Flowers has two consequences. Firstly, it wipes out the majority of specialists, engineers, scientists, agronomists, intellectuals, and architects who would be very useful during Mao's Great Leap Forward. And also, it encourages Mao to think that the socialist project is under siege from counter-revolutionaries and rightists on all sides, and that these are the people who should be got rid of, and that the socialist high tide needed to be brought back with greater vigour, and now the Great Leap Forward, which leads to catastrophe from 1958 to 1962. And the biggest famine in human history needed to be launched. So, from the secret speech sent shockwaves through Russia, through China, and the rest of the communist world, and it caused Mao to react in ways which contributed later to Mao's decision to launch the Great Leap Forward with disastrous consequences. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that and found it useful. I'm going to finish there. Do remember to check out the following things. Come by the Explaining History Facebook group. There's always a lively chat going on there. And also, if you can spare a tiny stipend, the Explaining History Patreon page always needs you. We survive on a tiny trickle of ad revenue, but not very much, so donations from our benefactors is always greatly received. Thanks very much, enjoy your week, and I'll be back next week with another Explaining History podcast. All the best, bye-bye.